HOA hired lawyers to seize my well. Then I showed the water rights they never read. Why would an HOA hire lawyers to seize a well? And what could those unread water rights reveal when they were finally brought forward? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. We are glad you are here for another story where property, authority, and the written record collide. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest stories. Thank you for watching, supporting the channel, and spending your valuable time with us. Your continued support truly means a lot. Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Now, let's get into the story. Step away from my pump house. Those were the first words out of my mouth at 6:12 on a cold Tuesday morning, when the rattle of my chain-link gate carried across 32 acres and told me somebody was standing where they had no business being. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I was 61 years old, and I had lived on that land long enough to recognize every ordinary sound before breakfast. The well pump had a low electric hum. The barn roof clicked when the temperature changed. Gravel popped beneath tires approaching from the county road. But that morning I heard metal scraping metal, followed by the unmistakable click of a camera shutter. I crossed the damp grass toward the small concrete pump house and found Diane Whitmore, president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association, standing beside an engineering contractor. He was photographing my pressure gauge, while casing and supply lined through the fence. Diane wore a navy jacket and held a clipboard against her chest, as if paperwork alone gave her permission to be there. "Good morning, Ethan," she said. "We are conducting an infrastructure assessment on my property. This well may be part of Cedar Ridge's legacy water infrastructure." I stopped beside the gate. The air smelled of wet soil, cold steel, and the faint mineral scent that always lingered around the pump house. "Maybe." Diane glanced toward the contractor. "The subdivision was developed from land historically connected to this water source. We are evaluating whether the association has continuing rights." I reached into my coat pocket and felt the old rusty key my father had carried before me. It opened the gate, the pump house, and a storage cabinet inside. Nobody from Cedar Ridge had ever held one. "Show me the recorded right that lets you turn my key." Diane's expression tightened. "Our attorneys are reviewing the documents. Then your attorneys can contact me after they find one." The contractor lowered his camera. Diane pointed toward the well casing. A small brass identification tag was bolted near the top, darkened around the edges from decades of weather. The number stamped into it matched the original well log my father had shown me years earlier. "This system predates Cedar Ridge," she said. "That does not make it Cedar Ridge property. More than 100 households depend on reliable water planning, and I am sure they do." That still does not answer my question. For a moment, only the pump motor filled the silence. Diane finally told the contractor they were finished. Before leaving, she turned beside her sport utility vehicle. "You should expect correspondence from council. I will read whatever they send." Her vehicle disappeared down the road, leaving 2 dark tire tracks across the morning gravel. I unlocked the gate and checked the pump house myself. Nothing appeared disturbed. The pressure held steady. Water moved through the pipe with the same quiet vibration I had felt thousands of times. Back in my workshop, I placed the rusty key on the bench and looked toward the loft. Behind an old toolbox sat a cedar-colored deed box that had belonged to my father. I had not opened it in years. Somewhere inside were surveys, well records, and property papers dating back farther than Cedar Ridge itself. I pulled the box down, wiped a layer of dust from the lid, and set it beside the key. Diane had arrived with an engineer because she believed history might give her association a claim to my well. If she wanted to argue history, I figured we should start by reading all of it. The lawyers arrived before the answers did. 2 days after Diane's visit, a certified envelope from Ellison, Parker, and Reed landed in my mailbox, thick enough to make the metal door drop with a clang. I carried it into the workshop, set it beside my father's deed box, and opened it under the yellow light above the workbench. The letter was signed by Mark Ellison, counsel for Cedar Ridge Estates. His firm requested immediate access to inspect the well's flow capacity, pump condition, electrical equipment, and potential connection points. 3 attorneys were copied beneath his signature. The letter referred repeatedly to historical use, legacy infrastructure, and community necessity, but nowhere did it identify a recorded easement granting Cedar Ridge access to my 32 acres. I read every page twice. Then I called the number printed at the top. Mark answered with the measured voice of a man accustomed to conversations becoming official the moment he spoke. "Mr. Caldwell, I assume you received our correspondence." "I did. I have one question." "Go ahead. What recorded right allows Cedar Ridge to enter my property or operate my well?" A short pause followed. "Our position is based on the development history and historical relationship between the source and the subdivision property." "That is history." I asked for the recorded right. "We are continuing our title review. Then when you find the instrument, send me the recording number." He shifted to community reliability, emergency planning, and the importance of evaluating infrastructure before problems occurred. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "Until you provide a recorded right, nobody representing Cedar Ridge has permission to enter the pump enclosure." That afternoon, Diane emailed me directly. She said more than 100 households depended on responsible water planning and suggested my refusal was delaying a routine assessment. I replied with the same request. "Show me the recorded right that lets you turn my key." She did not answer it. Instead, another letter arrived Monday proposing 3 inspection dates and warning that continued refusal could require formal legal action. I started a new folder labeled Cedar Ridge Well Claim and placed every letter inside by date. Laura, my daughter, stopped by that evening and found me comparing Mark's first letter with an old property survey. "3 lawyers for 1 well?" she asked. "Apparently the water tastes better when billed by the hour." She smiled, then noticed the deed box. "You opened Grandpa's records?" "Not all of them yet." We lifted the lid together. The smell of old paper, cedar dust, and machine oil rose from inside. There were tax receipts, surveys, handwritten maintenance notes, and a faded well log bearing the same identification number stamped into the brass tag outside. Beneath those papers sat several folded deeds tied with a cotton ribbon. I did not unfold them yet. First, I wanted to understand exactly what Cedar Ridge believed it owned. The next morning, Mark emailed a copy of an old development deed. One paragraph mentioned temporary access to water during subdivision construction. He highlighted it in yellow. I printed the page and read the paragraph above it, then the paragraph below it. Near the bottom was a reference to another recorded instrument concerning reserved water rights. No copy of that instrument was attached. No explanation appeared in Mark's letter. I circled the recording reference with a red pen. For the first time since Diane appeared at my gate, the pump house itself stopped being the most interesting part of their claim. 3 lawyers had sent me 14 pages explaining why Cedar Ridge needed my water. Buried inside their own evidence was a reference to the document that might answer whether they had ever owned a drop of it. By Tuesday afternoon, Cedar Ridge had turned my private well into a neighborhood talking point. Laura forwarded me a community notice Diane had sent to every homeowner that morning. It described an ongoing evaluation of a legacy water source and said the association was attempting to secure access for emergency reliability planning. My name never appeared, but it did not need to. Everyone along the western edge of Cedar Ridge knew which property held the old well. The notice ended by saying access had been delayed because the current landowner had not authorized inspection. I read that sentence twice, printed the notice, and added it to my folder. I did not respond on social media. I did not attend the neighborhood message board argument Laura told me had already started. Instead, I returned to Mark Ellison's development deed and wrote down every recording reference it contained. One number appeared beside the temporary water access paragraph. Another appeared beside the phrase reserved water rights. I called Mark shortly before 4. "I am reviewing the deed you sent." "Good. Then you understand why Cedar Ridge believes historical access exists." "I understand that the deed references another recorded instrument." Silence. "Which instrument?" "The one concerning reserved water rights." Papers moved on his end of the line. "Our office is reviewing the full title history." "Then please send me that document when you locate it." "Mr. Caldwell, the immediate issue is inspection access." "No. The immediate issue is whether your client has any right to request inspection as anything other than a guest." His voice remained controlled. "If we cannot resolve this voluntarily, the association is prepared to seek formal relief. Then make sure your filing includes the complete record." I ended the call and wrote the date and time on my notes. 2 hours later, another email arrived from Diane. She said Cedar Ridge had authorized additional legal spending because the matter affected community infrastructure. That was when I realized she was no longer investigating whether the HOA owned rights to my well. She had already decided it did, and now she was spending association money trying to make the paperwork catch up with her conclusion. The next evening, Cedar Ridge held a special board meeting. I sat in the back beside Laura while Diane addressed nearly 60 residents. "This is about responsible planning," she said. "No community should depend on the cooperation of one individual when historical infrastructure may serve everyone." Frank Dalton, the HOA treasurer, shifted in his chair. "Do we have a recorded easement?" he asked. Diane answered that council was evaluating historical documents. Frank tried again. "So we do not currently have one." Mark attended by speakerphone. "The legal position involves more than a single document." I leaned toward Laura. "It usually does when the single document is missing." When homeowner comments opened, I walked to the microphone carrying no papers. "I have offered one simple path since this began. Provide the recorded instrument granting Cedar Ridge rights to my well, and I will read it." Diane folded her hands. "And until then, my gate stays locked." The room became quiet. I returned home after dark and walked past the pump house before going inside. The pressure gauge glowed faintly beneath my flashlight. The brass tag caught the beam. The pump hummed steadily behind the concrete wall. Cedar Ridge had attorneys, meeting minutes, community notices, and a growing legal budget. I had a rusty key in my pocket and a recording number written on a yellow notepad. The strange thing was, the recording number was beginning to feel heavier. The clue had been sitting 10 feet above my head for years. Thursday evening, Laura climbed the wooden ladder to the workshop loft while I held a flashlight from below. Dust floated through the beam, and every step made the old boards creak. My father's deed box had already given us the development deed, but Laura remembered another stack of property papers he kept behind an old metal toolbox. She came down carrying a flat envelope stained brown at the corners. "This says well records." We cleared a space on the workbench. The rusty gate key rested beside my Cedar Ridge folder, and the room smelled of cedar dust, machine oil, and paper that had spent decades absorbing summer heat. Inside the envelope was the original well log. I checked the identification number against a handwritten maintenance sheet. It matched the brass tag on the casing outside. Beneath it was an older deed containing the same recording reference I had circled in Mark Ellison's document. I followed the paragraph slowly with my finger. The property transfer was subject to and incorporated a separately recorded declaration concerning groundwater, while ownership and temporary construction access. "There," Laura said. "That is the number." Exactly. The strange part was not that Cedar Ridge had overlooked some unrelated document buried in my family papers. Their own deed pointed directly to it. Mark had highlighted the temporary access language for me, yet his letter had said nothing about the declaration incorporated into that same section. I called the county records office the next morning. Rachel Monroe answered and searched the recording number while I waited beside the kitchen window. "I have it," she finally said. "Recorded water declaration. 47 years old. Can I get a certified copy?" "Absolutely." I drove downtown before lunch. The records office was cool and quiet, with the dry smell of paper and toner hanging beneath fluorescent lights. Rachel placed several pages on the counter. The first identified the Caldwell parcel and the original well. The next reserved groundwater and well rights to the Caldwell property. Then I reached the section governing the developer. It granted limited access to the well during construction of what eventually became Cedar Ridge. Not ownership, not permanent operational control, temporary access. I kept reading. The license terminated when the subdivision's permanent municipal water connection became operational. "Can you confirm when that happened?" I asked. Rachel searched another file. 23 years ago. I looked back at the declaration. 23 years. Whatever temporary privilege the developer once possessed had expired before Diane became HOA president, before Mark's law firm entered the picture, and long before anyone photographed my pressure gauge through a locked fence. I ordered certified copies of everything. Back at the workshop, Laura laid Mark's highlighted development deed beside the declaration. The recording reference on his page led directly to the document reserving the water rights to my land. "So they read this page," she said, tapping his exhibit, "but apparently never followed the reference. Or they followed it and did not like where it went." My phone rang before I could say more. Mark's office was notifying me that Cedar Ridge intended to move forward with a formal hearing request concerning access and historical use. I thanked his assistant and wrote down the date. Then I placed the certified water declaration inside my folder without sending Mark a copy. I had asked him repeatedly for the complete record. He had repeatedly told me his office was reviewing it. If Cedar Ridge wanted a hearing, they could have one. On the workbench, the old deed box sat open beside the rusty key. Outside, the pump started automatically, sending a low vibration through the pipe beneath the floor. For weeks, Diane had treated that sound like evidence of infrastructure her community could claim. Now I knew exactly what it was. It was water moving through a well my family had expressly reserved, under rights recorded 47 years earlier and referenced on the very page their lawyers had already put in my hands. The certified declaration changed the question completely. Cedar Ridge had spent weeks asking how much access it could claim, while the county record showed that its temporary access had ended 23 years earlier. I spent Saturday morning building a timeline across my kitchen table. 47 years ago, my family reserved the groundwater and well rights. During development, the builder received a temporary license to draw water for construction. 23 years ago, Cedar Ridge's permanent municipal connection became operational. On that date, according to the recorded declaration, the temporary license terminated. I called Rachel Monroe and requested certified confirmation of the municipal connection date. By Monday afternoon, I had it. Laura read the documents beside me while rain tapped softly against the kitchen window. "So there is no gap," she said. "Not that I can find." "Then why are they still going forward?" I closed the folder. "Because they started with the conclusion that the well should serve them. Everything after that has been an attempt to find paperwork supporting the conclusion." Tuesday brought another letter from Mark Ellison. Cedar Ridge intended to argue that historical use established continuing access expectations and that the well's location and development history justified county intervention. He also requested that I preserve all well records, maintenance logs, and ownership documents. I almost appreciated the irony. I had preserved more of their history than they apparently had. I replied that my records would be available through the proper hearing process and again requested the complete legal basis for Cedar Ridge's claimed right. Mark responded that his firm had reviewed the relevant chain of title. Relevant. That word caught my attention. I called him. "Mark, when you say relevant chain of title, does that include the recorded instrument incorporated into the development deed?" There was a brief pause. "Our team has reviewed the property documents supporting the association's position." "That is not what I asked. If you have materials you believe are significant, you may submit them." I asked whether you read the incorporated instrument. His tone cooled. "Mr. Caldwell, we are confident in our filing." "Good. Then the hearing should be simple." That evening, Cedar Ridge circulated another notice describing the upcoming proceeding as an effort to secure reliable emergency water access. Frank Dalton called me privately after receiving it. "Ethan," I asked Diane whether council confirmed ownership. "What did she say?" "She said ownership is not the only issue. It is a fairly important one when somebody wants my key." Frank sighed. "Some of us are starting to ask questions about the legal spending." I thanked him and said nothing about the certified declaration. By Wednesday, my hearing folder contained the original deed reference, the certified water right declaration, the municipal activation record, the original well log, and photographs of the brass identification tag. I arranged them in chronological order. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the pump house roof shining beneath a gray sky. I walked down with the rusty key, unlocked the gate, and rested my hand against the cool steel casing. The pump clicked on. The pressure needle climbed smoothly. Nothing about the well had changed since Diane first appeared with her contractor. What had changed was my understanding of the paper beneath it. Cedar Ridge had once possessed permission to use this water, but permission had carried an expiration condition, and that condition had been satisfied 23 years ago. Their temporary right had not been stolen, hidden, or transferred. It had simply ended. The hearing was 2 days away. Diane was preparing to argue that history belonged on her side. I was bringing 47 years of that history with me. The morning of the hearing, Mark Ellison called me before I had finished my coffee. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but the timing told me Cedar Ridge wanted one last chance to control what happened next. "Mr. Caldwell, We can still avoid a formal proceeding if you authorize a limited inspection. I looked through the kitchen window toward the pump house, where the wet steel roof reflected the first pale light of morning. Has your firm reviewed the entire chain of title? Yes, Mark said. We are comfortable with the record. I let that answer sit for a second. Including the instrument incorporated on page 6 of the development deed? The silence was brief, but it was there. As I said, our team has reviewed the relevant documents. That was not my question. We have reviewed the entire chain necessary to support our position. I glanced at the certified water declaration lying inside my folder. Then I suppose we will discuss it at the hearing. Mark shifted back to compromise. He suggested Cedar Ridge only wanted technical information about flow capacity and emergency connection feasibility. I reminded him that 3 weeks earlier Diane had called my well legacy infrastructure and that his own letters claimed historical access. You cannot ask me to treat this like a friendly inspection after threatening formal action to obtain it. His voice tightened. Nobody is threatening you. Good. Then we agree the record can decide this. I ended the call and wrote the time beside his statement about reviewing the entire chain of title. At 10:30, I drove to the county administration building with Laura beside me. My folder rested between us, heavier with certified paper than it had any right to feel. Cedar Ridge had arrived early. Diane stood outside the hearing room wearing a charcoal blazer, speaking quietly with Mark and 2 other attorneys. 3 legal briefcases sat beneath their chairs. A rolled site map leaned against the wall. When Diane saw me, her expression settled into the polished confidence she used at board meetings. Ethan, she said, this never needed to become adversarial. I agree. Then perhaps you should reconsider access before we begin. Did your attorneys find the recorded right? She looked toward Mark. They found enough. That answer told me everything I needed to know. Inside, the hearing room smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and fresh coffee. A county seal hung behind the raised desk. Residents from Cedar Ridge filled several rows, including Frank Dalton, who gave me a small nod. Mark arranged his exhibits while Diane whispered to him. Their largest display was an enlarged copy of the old development deed. I recognized the yellow highlighted temporary water language immediately. Page 6. The same page containing the recording reference they had never explained. Laura leaned toward me. They are actually using it. Apparently. Do they know? Mark says they reviewed everything. The clerk called the matter shortly after 11. Mark began by describing the subdivision's development history, the well's historical role, and Cedar Ridge's concern for emergency water reliability. Diane sat beside him with her hands folded neatly over a legal pad. Then Mark placed page 6 on the display and pointed to the language granting the developer access to the well during construction. I watched the document appear large enough for everyone in the room to read. Near the bottom, almost ignored beneath his highlighted paragraph, sat the recording reference I had circled weeks earlier. I opened my folder and touched the raised county seal on the certified declaration. Mark continued speaking confidently about historical continuity. I did not interrupt him. I did not need to. Their strongest exhibit was already pointing directly toward the document that ended their claim. Mark spoke for another 12 minutes before the county hearing officer finally turned toward me. By then, Cedar Ridge's enlarged page 6 had been displayed so long that I could almost see the recording number from my chair. Mr. Caldwell, you may respond. I stood, carried my folder to the table, and placed one certified document beside Mark's exhibit. I would like to begin with a recording number. I read it slowly. The clerk entered it into her system, then looked toward the hearing officer. Confirmed. Recorded water declaration, 47 years ago. Mark stopped writing. Diane's hands remained folded, but her expression changed. I asked the clerk whether the declaration was incorporated by reference into the development deed Cedar Ridge had submitted. She compared the numbers. Yes, the reference appears on page 6. I pointed toward their enlarged exhibit. Right there. Several residents leaned forward. I did not raise my voice. I simply opened the certified declaration. This document reserves the groundwater and well rights to the Caldwell parcel. It also grants the original developer temporary access to the well during construction. Mark stood. Historical access is exactly what the association has been describing. Temporary historical access, I said, and the document tells us when it ends. I turned to the termination provision and read the relevant language aloud in plain terms. The construction license ended when Cedar Ridge's permanent municipal water connection became operational. Then I placed Rachel Monroe's certified municipal record beside it. That connection became operational 23 years ago. The room went so quiet I could hear someone turning a page behind me. The hearing officer reviewed both documents. Counsel, does the association dispute the municipal activation date? Mark leaned toward one of the attorneys beside him. They whispered for several seconds. Not at this time. Does the association possess a separately recorded permanent easement? Another pause. We have not presented one today. Diane turned toward him sharply. That was the first moment her confidence visibly slipped. The hearing officer looked back at the enlarged development deed. Your own exhibit incorporates the declaration Mr. Caldwell has provided. Mark nodded once. Yes. I returned to my chair, but the hearing officer asked me to remain at the table. Mr. Caldwell, when did you obtain this certified declaration? Earlier this week, after following the recording reference in Cedar Ridge's exhibit. Mark looked at me. He understood exactly what that meant. I had not uncovered a secret document hidden in some forgotten family vault. I had followed the citation printed on the same deed his firm had been relying upon. The hearing officer asked Mark whether his title review had included the incorporated declaration before the association requested formal relief. His answer came more carefully this time. Our initial review focused on the development instruments provided by the client. I remembered our phone call that morning. Entire chain of title. Comfortable with the record. Confident in the filing. Now every phrase sounded different. Diane whispered something to him, but Mark shook his head slightly. I closed my folder and rested my hand on its cover. 3 weeks earlier, Diane had stood outside my pump house and told me the well might belong to Cedar Ridge's legacy infrastructure. Since then, they had sent attorneys, notices, inspection demands, and an enlarged deed into a county hearing room. In the end, I had not needed a clever argument. Their own page 6 had supplied the directions. All I had done was follow them to the document they should have read before they ever came looking for my key. The hearing officer did not rule immediately. Instead, she asked Cedar Ridge to explain why the association had pursued formal access without first resolving the termination language in the recorded declaration. Mark requested a short recess. Diane followed him into the hallway with the other attorneys, while Laura and I remained inside. Frank Dalton crossed the room and stopped beside our table. There is something you should know, he said quietly. He explained that months earlier, before the engineering contractor ever appeared at my gate, Cedar Ridge's former property manager had questioned whether the well belonged to the association at all. According to Frank, she had emailed Diane after reviewing older development records and specifically warned that the water rights appeared to have been excluded from subdivision ownership. Do you still have that email? I asked. Frank nodded. It was sent to the board account. I found it after Diane authorized the legal budget. When the hearing resumed, Frank asked permission to submit the correspondence as a Cedar Ridge board record. Diane's face tightened as the clerk accepted the printed email. The message was brief, dated nearly 4 months earlier, and remarkably clear. The former manager recommended a complete title review before any claim was made, because preliminary records suggested the well and groundwater rights remained with the Caldwell parcel. The hearing officer looked toward Diane. Were you aware of this recommendation? Diane adjusted the papers in front of her. I believed later information supported further investigation. Further investigation is not the same as filing for access, the hearing officer replied. Mark leaned toward his microphone. For clarity, our firm was initially provided selected development documents by the association. We were not provided the complete historical water right file when we began our review. Diane turned toward him. Your firm told us there was a viable claim, based on the materials provided. That distinction landed harder than any argument I could have made. Frank then produced the board authorization showing Diane had approved preliminary legal spending before commissioning an independent title search. The paper trail was suddenly simple. She had been warned there might be no association right. She had moved forward anyway. Her attorneys had received selected records. Those records contained a reference to the declaration that ended the temporary license, but nobody had followed that reference before the dispute escalated. The hearing officer reviewed the documents for several minutes before speaking. At present, I see evidence of a historical temporary license that terminated 23 years ago. I see no permanent easement, no recorded ownership interest in the well, and no demonstrated basis for compelled access. Mark requested permission to confer with his client. This time the recess lasted almost 20 minutes. Through the glass panel in the hallway door, I could see Diane speaking with him, her gestures smaller now, her shoulders no longer carrying the certainty she had brought to my property. When they returned, Mark announced that Cedar Ridge would withdraw its request pending formal board review. Nobody applauded. Nobody needed to. I gathered my certified documents and slid them back into the folder. Diane avoided looking toward me. Frank sat down among the homeowners, holding the email that had changed the second half of the hearing. Outside, the afternoon air smelled like wet pavement after a brief shower. Laura walked beside me toward the parking lot. "So that is it?" she asked. I looked back at the county building. The hearing is over. The paperwork is not. Because withdrawing a claim stopped Cedar Ridge from taking my key that day. I wanted something stronger. I wanted the record to make sure nobody from that association ever came back 20 years later pretending the same expired permission had somehow become permanent. The final paperwork arrived 11 days after the hearing, and this time Cedar Ridge sent only 4 pages. I read them at the same workbench where my father's deed box still sat open beneath the yellow shop light. The association formally withdrew every claim of ownership, operational control, permanent access, and emergency connection authority over my well. More importantly, the agreement acknowledged that the temporary construction license had terminated 23 years earlier and created no continuing easement for Cedar Ridge. I read that sentence twice, then placed the document beside the rusty key. Frank called that evening with the rest of the news. The board had completed an internal review of the legal spending. From then on, any claim involving infrastructure located on property outside association ownership required an independent title examination before association money could be used to pursue it. Diane resigned as president before the next regular meeting. She remained a homeowner, but she no longer controlled the board agenda or authorized legal action. Mark's firm sent a separate letter confirming that Cedar Ridge would not seek another inspection without my written permission or a newly established legal right. There was no apology hidden inside the legal language, but I had never needed one. I needed the record corrected. 2 mornings later, I walked toward the pump house just after sunrise. The grass was silver with dew, and the air carried that familiar mixture of damp soil and cold metal. For the first time in weeks, there were no contractor vehicles beside the road, no certified envelopes waiting in my mailbox, and no emails demanding inspection dates. I pulled the rusty key from my coat pocket and slid it into the chain-link gate. The lock turned with the same dry click I had heard thousands of times. Inside, the brass tag on the well casing caught the morning light. I brushed my thumb across the stamped identification number, the same number recorded on the old well log in my father's box. Then the pressure switch clicked. The pump came alive beneath the concrete floor, steady and low, and the needle on the gauge began to rise. A few seconds later, water moved through the pipe with a deep, smooth hum. I stood there listening. That sound had been the center of every argument Cedar Ridge made. To Diane, it represented infrastructure the community could use. To the lawyers, it became a historical connection they thought might support access. To me, it was simpler. It was a working well on land my family had protected with language precise enough to survive 47 years of assumptions. Laura came by later and found me returning the certified declaration to the cedar-colored deed box. "You keeping all of that?" she asked. "Every page." I tied the old deeds together again, placed the municipal record on top, and added Cedar Ridge's withdrawal letter. The box was heavier when I closed it than when I had opened it, because now it contained the ending too. They had arrived believing enough lawyers, notices, and community pressure could turn temporary permission into permanent control. But property rights do not become someone else's simply because they are useful. They brought lawyers because they thought enough paper could give them my well. All I needed was the one piece of paper they never bothered to read.